Rick and Jeff Kuperman are the choreographers of the musical The Outsiders on Broadway. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. I wanted to start with a question for both of you, which is, this show is all about youth and brotherhood and community and belonging. And you're working with this incredible young ensemble of actors, many of whom are making their Broadway debuts. What was it like to kind of help them navigate that experience and to try to harness all of that enthusiasm into this really dynamic show?
Yeah, it's an incredible company, and you're right. There's a ton of vitality and joy and energy on that stage every night, and also a ton of talent that we're working with here. Part of our role was to certainly nurture that talent, and then bring in even more sort of technique and craft and consistency, so that what they're doing up on that stage is repeatable 8 times a week. And they've certainly all risen to that challenge, and we're very proud of the work that they're doing.
Yeah, and even during the process, this show is so much about individuality, and their DNA is baked into the very foundation of the show. So it was extremely exciting to help curate and like Rick said, nurture that creativity on top of their talent.
Yeah, there's so much creativity, not only in the choreography and the performers, but of your director, Danya Tamor, who has just done an extraordinary job bringing this story to life in a very, at times the staging is very simple, but always so evocative. And there's some beautiful set pieces in the show. What was it like collaborating with her on, finding the visual language of the story and how to move, these characters around in the space? We'll stick with you, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really a collaboration of a lifetime, to be honest. It's been a real pleasure the way that the three of us pass the baton, so to speak. And part of the beauty of this show is to me what makes a good musical theater show is when you don't see that pass off. And it really started in our first workshop in the Dale Roth Theater a couple of years ago. We had a few weeks, and we said, well, what are our goals for these few weeks? Let's get the thing on its feet and discover how it moves. Let's discover what mode of storytelling we're gonna use. And we did that. It was a bunch of theater blocks and some rolling cubes and stuff like that. But we put the whole thing on its feet, and that ethos carried over into the design process when we were working with AMP, our incredible team of set designers. And so it was very organic in that way. Yeah, Rick, you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to add, it is the collaboration of a lifetime. Danya is an absolute brilliant director and leader, and it's just been a huge privilege and honor to work alongside Danya to bring this to life.
How much did you both study the source material? Because obviously you're working with a wonderful, book adaptation of the novel and of the film. And there's so much in that script to, kind of guide the work. But did you return to the novel at times to kind of get more backstory on the characters? Did you look at the film for kind of how that, how the kind of visual language of that worked? Or was it really just kind of focused on the words you had and the vision of your collaborators? Rick?
Yeah, so I was kind of late to the party because I was one of the few members of the creative team that actually didn't read The Outsiders as a student. But I did read a lot of Adam Rapp's plays when I was in college. So my first introduction to The Outsiders was through Adam's script, and the stage directions, the way that guy, writes dialogue, but stage directions too, is just incredible. And a lot of the blueprint of how the show might move was right there in front of us on the page.
Yeah, I'll say, for example, for the Rumble sequence, Adam was very clear: no music, just the sound of fists detonating into flesh. That was one of the stage directions that really stuck out to me. So as we were, and the Rumble was one of the first things that we worked out. Once we worked out how the Rumble moved, that trickled down and throughout that movement vocabulary was the essence that we used throughout. So fists detonating into flesh. How do we make this rumble as impactful as it was on film? But of course, we're not on film. We're in the theater. How do we borrow the grammar of cinema to elevate the rumble? And that stage direction and that thought got us thinking that the way that we interpret violence so often on film is hourly. And how do we keep that brutality, that visceral feeling of pain and the uselessness of the tragedy of the rumble? That was kind of the starting point for so much of the rumble, and then so much of how we rendered violence in general on that stage.
I'm so glad you brought up the rumble, and let's dive into that, and then we'll kind of backtrack to earlier great moments, because I think the rumble is one of the more extraordinary and extraordinarily staged things I've seen in a very long time. It's just such an exquisite, like, visceral experience to sit there and watch it. How did you guys approach this very long sequence? I mean, it's, as you said, there's no score. There is some kind of, sensory and auditory things going on, but there's no score to kind of stage it to. There's fight choreography. There's some really beautiful choreography. There's so many different kind of facets and phases of this long sequence. How did you just kind of approach putting that together? Because it really, when you're sitting in the theater, you're just kind of overwhelmed by the experience. So what was that like? And how long did you have to, work with these guys and really bring it to life?
Yeah, well, you said it yourself that there are phases to the rumble, and that's exactly how we thought about it from the inception, which is it needs to start naturalistically, it needs to start realistically. We want to see this full-fledged war between these two groups happen, and then there's some sound design that helps the actors know that, okay, it's the end of this phase of the fight. Now we're moving on to the second phase of the fight, et cetera, et cetera. But our goal was always that the rumble ramps from naturalism into a more expressionistic mode. And when you're doing fight choreography, you're not fighting an enemy. Obviously, you're fighting a partner, and so the whole point of it is to take care of your partner without making it look like that. But actually, when you divorce, the two partners from each other, you're able to sell the violence so much more viscerally. And that was one of the things that we wanted to do, was how do we ramp from naturalism to expressionism without ever breaking the audience's engagement in it, without ever feeling like, oh, now we were fighting and now we're dancing. So we're glad that we were able to explore that early on.
Yeah, and in terms of rehearsal time, this is a sequence that we first started to explore in very early days, a couple of years ago, when we were doing that that workshop, very early workshop at the Daryl Roth. And of course, it continued to morph, and we did a version at La Jolla. So by the time we were actually rehearsing for Broadway, a lot of the performers knew a lot of the staging and vocabulary for it, and we did it relatively quickly. It's the rehearsal schedules for Broadway are just very tight, but it's something that the more reps you get of, the more embodied it feels, and the more comfortable the performers get, until it's like second nature.
Yeah, the sound design came from that workshop, that workshop we had a few years ago. We would workshop a few ideas, go home, kind of make a mini violence score, so that we were ready for the next day to start putting it together. And one of my favorite sequences within the rumble is when it's just kind of a slow motion rolling sequence, which is at the heart of the conflict. It's these boys, these kids trapped in a cycle of violence, and they're unable to extricate themselves from it. So if that moment itself is, to me, emblematic of the rumble.
Yeah, and the show opens, it's set in Tulsa, 1967, as the opening number tells us so well. And I wanted to ask you, how much did you know of that period, and how much did the kind of dance style that was popular at the time, inform any of the decisions that you made? Because obviously we're working with two very different sets of characters. who are introduced in that opening number too. So did you take into consideration, what was kind of popular at that time for at least the Socias, if not the Greasers as well?
Yeah, and definitely. I mean, we were lucky to actually go down to Tulsa early in the development of the project to meet Susie and to really get a sense of the city and the history and the culture. And it was an amazing and super informative trip. And at the same time, you never want these kind of shows to feel like a time capsule, right? You want them to be in conversation with modern culture and a modern way of moving. So I think about it really as a fusion between some of the, more popular historical styles and vocabulary that will still feel fresh to modern audiences.
Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing what Rick said, I'm glad that we were able to pull from some of that, that's those styles that were popular back then, and get a sense of how these two groups might have interacted. There's an anthropologist working on the show, Dr. Michael Ralph, who was very useful in breaking down some of the trends of that time. And of course you'll recognize some movement from that time period, but it's certainly not just that. It's a kind of a amalgamation of that with some contemporary musical theater, with some physical theater, with some more athletic movement, all that stuff.
Yeah, and one of the sort of potential traps that we were hoping to avoid is like really delineating Socias and Greasers to the point of just red team, blue team, where they have no shared vocabulary. But the truth is that, as we see in the drive-in sequence in the first act, that while they are certainly very distinct social groups, they also share a public space, and they also are all teenagers in Tulsa 1967. So we wanted to make sure that the movement idiom was balanced in that way, and still made it feel unified, that they all lived in the same world of the show.
Yeah, that is another one of the standout numbers of the show that I wanted to ask you about, that drive-in sequence, which is so fun. And obviously there's, animosity between these two groups as you're describing, but the way that you kind of have them interacting in that space through dance is so exciting, and reminded me, of course, of Dance at the Gym from West Side Story and other really great, wonderful, kind of predecessors and dance-heavy shows. Did you take inspiration from any of those kind of shows in the past that had similar themes, or how much were you really trying to, while yes, it's maybe similar in terms of, the story that you're telling in a different time and place, want to differentiate, and make it a totally kind of standalone piece, or are you kind of quoting, certain moments and styles? Rick?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're indebted to West Side Story and that whole lineage. It would be crazy to say that we're not. It's, of course, left an indelible mark. And at the same time, The Outsiders is a grittier, kind of rawer take on what it is to be a teenager. And so we were, hoping to really continue to lean into what sets The Outsiders apart. From the other stories that take place at a similar time and deal with similar themes. Of course, the drive-in still has that sense of oil and water and how these two groups really can't mix. But the hope was to attack it from what makes The Outsiders unique.
Yeah, and I would just say that the way that choreography functions in The Outsiders, it's such a fine line, because if it gets like too dancey, then you're kind of scratching your head and you're like, why are they dancing? And so of course there are a few diegetic moments where dancing makes sense, but it never really made sense to us that like, oh, now there's like everyone does the same thing for 8 counts of 8. There is a little unison, but it never felt like we should go there. And so that's why I think, the drive-in would feel different than the Dance at the Gym in that way. Yeah.
I think it's in conversation with the style of the rest of the show, which is very minimalist and stripped down and raw and honest and truthful. And so, our goal was to make sure that the choreography was very much in line with that overall aesthetic, while still providing those, those moments and elements of athleticism and dynamism and kineticism that you need and want and deserve in a Broadway musical.
Absolutely. And, one final number I want to ask you about, even though, we could talk about every moment in the show because there's always some wonderful, and unique piece of movement in it. But one of the early numbers, Grease Got a Hold on You, where Ponyboy is kind of being initiated into the Greasers, is such a fun moment and such a fun number. And it stands out because a lot of the show, of course, is emotional and heavy, and there's a lot of really serious things going on. But this is just kind of an early moment of levity. They're, raising Ponyboy up, and after, an encounter with the Socias. So how did you kind of just incorporate that fun? What was it like for you to, after working on that rumble that's so intense, to really just kind of, embrace the kind of grittiness, but also the play and the kind of clowning of the characters?
Yeah. I mean,
go ahead.
Go ahead. All right. So, hey, okay. So, it's Grease Got a Hold is so fun because there are a few clear actions going on through the entire number, which is, first of all, we got to meet all of the greasers and we got to see what makes them tick and what makes them unique. So that's a cool mandate. We also got to teach Ponyboy what it means to be a greaser from all the different points of views of the individual greasers. You're not a greaser like that. You're a greaser like this. This is what it means to be a greaser. So having that clarity of storytelling is really thrilling. So it means that we're able to make all the dancing intentional and serve a purpose. So that was a really good guiding principle. But you're right. It's just another opportunity to let the steam blow off, so to speak, before we embark on a train ride that just goes down, down, down. And it was an opportunity to show off the athleticism and the vigor of the company, and so we relish that for sure.
Yeah, and I was just going to give a little bit more of a personal angle, which is that Jeff and I, we grew up in Toronto, studying dance, training at a studio called Vlad's Dance Company, and there were a lot of boys who would train there. A lot of boys would come from kind of all over the province to train there. Vlad is an extraordinary teacher and choreographer and artist. And each guy that we shared a dressing room with and shared the stage with had their own personality and their own style and their own kind of virtuosic elements and tricks that they had developed over the years. And that number felt very much like sort of going back to Vlad's or back to our youth and our training and highlighting those individual members in a way.
Rick and Jeff Kuperman, congratulations on The Outsiders. Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Thank you.